Good evening and welcome to tonight's program, Her Story, Our Nation, presented by A Tour of Her Own. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rachel Blomquist, librarian at the Putnam County Public Library District. Before we begin, I have just a few brief announcements. On Tuesday, May 26th at 5 p.m. Central, we will host Chapter 250, Reading America's Story Together, our monthly community book club exploring the American Revolution through shared reading, conversation, and film. This month's featured book is A Girl Called Samson by Amy Harmon. On Tuesday, June 9th at 6 p.m. Central, historian and librarian Anna Seeliff will present on the history of women's baseball in Illinois and the Midwest. And on Tuesday, June 16th at 6 p.m. Central, artist and art historian Denise Lauren will lead a multimedia discussion exploring the pivotal works of art that documented the Revolutionary War and the remarkable transformation of George Washington from man to myth. All programs are free and open to the public, offered in both in-person and virtual formats. A note for tonight's attendees: if you are joining us virtually, please use the chat to submit your questions. If you are here in person, we will turn on the camera and microphone at the end of the presentation. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Rebecca Grahl from A Tour of Her Own. Rebecca is a professional tour guide, historian, and author, and a founding member and vice president of education for A Tour of Her Own, a Washington, D.C. tourism company specializing in women's history tours, book talks, and virtual experiences. She is also the co-author of 111 Places in Women's History in Washington that You Must Not Miss. Welcome, Rebecca, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Excuse me. I'm so happy to be with you this evening. As mentioned, I'm with A Tour of Our Own. I did just drop in the chat our website and our Instagram account. I hope that you'll take a look at what we do at A Tour of Our Own. But we are the first tour company in Washington, D.C. to focus exclusively on women's history. We've existed since 2018, so this is a very exciting year for us. It is the semi-quincentennial of our nation, America 250, and it's always a good time to talk about women's history, but especially during America 250. I did want to mention the book as well. I'm holding it up on my screen here, but 111 Places in Women's History in Washington, D.C. that you must not miss is the book that me and Toho founder Caitlin Caligira co-authored. It was published in 2021, and I'm thrilled to announce that this summer we will have the third edition coming out. So we went through and updated things. There are some new chapters, new stories, new information. So if you're looking to get a copy, this summer would be a great time. As mentioned, I think that if you want to use the chat box for questions, that would be great. I will try to keep an eye on the chat as we're going, but at the end, we can also delve into questions as well. So I've got my presentation up on the screen. If you're having any trouble, just take a look at the chat box, let me know. But we want to take a little look at America 250, at the women who helped shape this nation at its founding, but also through the last 250 years. I'm going to share some stories of some women that I think are really fascinating, incredible trailblazers, women who helped create the nation that we know today. And I'll also share with you a few places in Washington where you might be able to see these women's story told through some unusual spots. So I think it's really important for us to just start at the beginning. 1776, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, but several months before that declaration would ever be written and approved and signed, Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband, John Adams, to which she said, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. I always think of this as kind of a rallying cry anytime I'm out there leading tours for A Tour of Our Own, is to remember the ladies. It's so easy when we're talking about our nation's history, especially the founding era, to focus on the men that were in the room at Independence Hall, but women were there in the United States at the forefront in the revolution. And even in 1776, there were women saying, don't forget about us. Remember that we were here. Do better by us. This revolution, this war would be fought with the contributions of many, many patriots, and they weren't just men. So I like to start with Abigail Adams and have Remember the Ladies as our rallying cry for tonight. Now, speaking of the Declaration of Independence, one of the women that I love to talk about and share a little bit about is a woman named Mary Catherine Goddard. She is the only woman who actually has her name on the Declaration of Independence. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, Rebecca, I know that there are 56 signers of the Declaration and none of them are a woman. We would have learned that in school. That is true, but her name is still on the Declaration. Mary Catherine Goddard came from a printer's family. Her father, she grew up around printing presses and publishing. Many newspapers throughout New England were printed and published by the Goddard family. And she took over one of those papers, the Maryland Journal, from her brother in 1774. She would run it for a decade, at which point her brother basically forces her out of the job that she had done very, very well for 10 years. I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about printers and publishers in this era, in the 1770s, 1780s, what an important job that was. Printing was not something that everybody could do. And so you were really the source of news and information. You printed government documents. Government contracts were really important for your financial success. So as a publisher or printer, if you're doing anything that might upset the government at hand, you're definitely putting your livelihood at risk. This does not stop Mary Catherine Goddard. She takes over the Maryland Journal in 1774, and she is a patriot through and through. She believes strongly in this cause of patriotism. She'd be one of the first newspapers to print Common Sense by Thomas Paine. She would write her own editorials, sort of outlining the brutality of the British against the colonists. She would print and reprint many revolutionary documents, including things that originated with the Sons of Liberty. And when the Declaration of Independence is adopted, the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, has to get it out to the people. Not everybody's in Philadelphia. Not everybody knows what's going on. And so they are going to order what was then the second printing of the Declaration of Independence in 1777. This is in January, so the document's only about 6 months old. Mary Catherine Goddard volunteers to do the second printing of the Declaration of Independence. The bravery of this is phenomenal to me. At this point, the war is still going on. We have no idea if we're going to come out ahead, if we're going to beat the British. She was jeopardizing not just the livelihood of her business, but truly the safety and security of herself and her family. But she was adamant in the cause of liberty. And so she printed the Declaration of Independence. What she does that I think is pretty cool is actually two things. This is what's known as the Goddard Broadside. It's the second printing of the Declaration of Independence. Two things that are neat. One, if you look at the image on the screen, you'll see that all the signatures are actually typed out. In the very first printing of the Declaration, it only had John Hancock's name and Charles Thompson's name, the Secretary of Congress. She decided to really break down all the signatures into typeset, organize them by colony, by state, so that everybody reading this would know who had signed on to this, where they came from. It showed how united we were in this effort. And then, as you can see in the little close-up image here, she also then puts Baltimore in Maryland, printed by Mary Catherine Goddard. That is such a baller move. She wanted to make sure that people knew that she had printed it and that this was the work of a woman. Now, she wasn't just a printer, she was also a postmaster, a job to which she was very successful and very skilled at. But you can imagine, as the revolution ends, as this new country is formed, new jobs are created, new government oversight is created. All of a sudden, the Postmaster General, a man named Samuel Osgood, decides that despite the fact that she's done this job for more than a decade, she is no longer qualified. And so she will lose her job because, quote, in his words, the job required more traveling than a woman could undertake. Now, the people of Baltimore were pretty upset about her losing the postmaster position. 200 very well-established businessmen wrote a petition to try to get her job back. She actually wrote to George Washington, who did write her a really lovely letter about her commitment to the cause and the printing of the Declaration, but neither of those efforts were enough to help her get her job as postmaster back. So as we head into America 250, I encourage you to remember the name of Mary Catherine Goddard and share it with others. Now, another woman of the Revolution that I love to share about is a woman named Elizabeth Bergen. I think we often think about the role of women in the Revolution as that very important home front role, defending their farms and taking over businesses. I think of Martha Washington at Mount Vernon running that estate while her husband is off fighting and leading troops during the war. But women could often go places a little less recognizably than men. It's a little easier to move around. And so it's not surprising to me that women were spying in the American Revolution. We often say that George Washington did not outfight the British, he outspied the British, and Elizabeth Bergen was part of that effort. We suspect that she was likely part of the Culper Ring, which was the prominent spy ring of the American Revolution. She was, though, a mother and a widow. She was deeply passionate about the revolutionary cause, and she saw an opportunity to help. During the war, there were American prisoner of wars being held on British ships. The record keeping of these prisoners was pretty non-existent. They weren't keeping good numbers on how many people were on each individual ship. We're talking about thousands and thousands of soldiers that were being held on these ships. So nobody was keeping a really detailed record of who was coming on. So in 1777, Bergen decides that she can help with the revolution by sneaking onto the ships. Now, she can come onto the ship as a woman. She can drop off food and supplies, but it turns out that she's clever enough that she actually is able to help 200 individual men escape the ships with her pretty much unnoticed. Eventually, the British do catch on to what she's doing. They actually put out a reward for her capture for 200 pounds. She had to flee New Jersey, which is where these prison ships were held. She actually appeals to Congress for help, and George Washington would write a letter vouching for her services in aiding prisoners. And in fact, it was, quote, measures in facilitating the escape of prisoners, which I think is a great way to say that. She took a commission from Congress, a stipend essentially from Congress for her spy work, but then she felt as though she was getting money even after she was no longer able to sneak on these ships. So she volunteered in exchange for the commission that she was paid to actually sew linens, uniforms, and other supplies for the Continental Army. So she ultimately would receive a pension for her wartime service, but we know that at least 200 prisoners escaped thanks to her efforts, possibly even more. And then I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a woman who actually found herself on the battlefield fighting fervently the War of Independence. And that is, of course, Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson was not just content to do what she could behind the scenes. She was tall, she was broad, she was strong. She knew she could be an asset on the battlefield. She decided to disguise herself as a man and serve as a soldier. That maybe sounds easier said than done in this era. In fact, the first time she tried to go to enlist, she actually ran away, perhaps too worried that she was too recognizable as a woman. But she does manage to get herself enlisted. She serves for more than a year undetected as a soldier. She was actually part of a special unit. She served in Massachusetts in a couple different units under the name of Robert Charliffe. The only thing that really is going to help unveil her identity is she is going to be injured in battle. She tried to avoid the medical tent whenever she could. She knew that was very likely going to lead to her discovery as a woman. So one time when she was shot, she got a bullet in the leg. She removed it herself with a penknife and sewing needle to avoid actually having anybody look under her uniform. Eventually, due to a very serious illness, she does eventually have to go to a medical tent. Her identity is revealed, but that was 2 years later, almost 2 years later. She was the recipient of an honorable discharge. She did get a military pension from Massachusetts. And as a veteran, she actually toured around the country talking about her wartime service and talking about the dedication of women to the cause of American Revolution. Now, we've talked about just three women right there who were really pivotal in the founding of our nation and in the fight for independence. But as the years went by after the American Revolution, it was very easy to forget or dismiss the contributions or simply write them off as the wives of important men. As we reached the late 1800s, there was actually an uptick in the formation of heritage and history groups to honor the American Revolution. And when an organization called the Sons of the American Revolution voted against the idea of accepting female members, a woman named Mary Smith Lockwood wrote an editorial for the Washington Post. In this editorial, she says, Were there no mothers of the revolution? And I think that is a quote that I love to carry with me whenever I think about the founding era, or really any era in American history. When we talk about these wars, when we talk about these defining moments, it's easy again to focus on the famous male names, but we know that there were mothers there. We know that there were women there. And so Mary Smith Lockwood's Were There No Mothers of the Revolution rings very true for me. She and three other ladies would go on to found the Daughters of the American Revolution to help preserve that revolutionary history. Now, another woman who played an important role in really documenting and understanding the contributions of the Revolutionary era was a woman named Elizabeth Elliot. Elizabeth Elliot was a very accomplished writer and author, as you can see, historian, poet. This doesn't even do her justice. She wrote essays, she wrote criticisms, literary criticisms, she wrote fiction and nonfiction. She wrote in every genre. She wrote travelogues, she wrote histories, and she became particularly intrigued by the idea of documenting women's contributions during the American Revolution. At the time that she started working on this project, it was the 1840s. So we were 60 years from the Revolutionary era. Her grandfather had served in the American Revolution, so a couple generations separated, but she thought it would be important before it was too late to try to find out where were women during the Revolutionary War. So she worked for several years. She traveled around the country. She wrote to people. She found unpublished letters. She found family diaries. She interviewed descendants of Revolutionary era Americans, and she compiled such a comprehensive book. It was published initially in two volumes in 1845. It was called it was the first version of The Women of the American Revolution. She published the second edition, which was three volumes in 1856. She said, quote, "It was almost impossible now to appreciate the vast influence of women's patriotism upon the destinies of the infant republic." Nobody had really done this level of work to really document that role of women to the revolution. And she goes on to do something very similar with documenting basically a comprehensive encyclopedia of women artists of all ages, a project she does right after this revolutionary project. And then she decides to publish really the first major home economics, home ec encyclopedia. It was called The Practical Housekeeper. It was 600 pages long. It was the most comprehensive book that could provide a guide to women and domestic work. It was divided into three sections: cooking, housekeeping, and then my favorite section, pharmaceutical, was sort of an acknowledgement that so much of the primary medical care that most people experience in their day-to-day life happened at home from their mother or grandmother or wife. And so, epic writer Elizabeth Elliot, she's really recognized today as a pioneer in women's history for taking the time to really research and document women's contributions to the revolution. Now, around the time that she is compiling this book, we've got a group of women gathering together to write the Declaration of Sentiments. This is a direct response to the 1776 Declaration of Independence. This is born out of the Seneca Falls Convention. I included a quote here, but I think it's important to just focus on: "We insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens." Again, this is two or three generations from the Revolutionary era. We have women recognizing that we need to be fully absorbed into the rights of citizenship. The Seneca Falls Convention was really the brainchild of this woman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I will note that the image on your screen here is her portrait from the National Portrait Gallery here in Washington, D.C. The Portrait Gallery is a wonderful resource, and for America 250, they have really built a museum-wide exhibition sort of celebrating great men and women from the 250 years of America. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is at the forefront of the women's movement in the 19th century. She was a woman ahead of her time. She is a mother, a wife. She does all of this advocacy work in addition to running her household. But when she gets married, she does strike the word obey from her wedding vows, which I think was a very savvy mood. She organized the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 with the understanding that women would not be able to gain those rights of citizen, fight for those rights of citizenship without an organized political movement. That small scale grassroots efforts was important, but there needed to be a coalition, and it needed to have a platform. It needed to have a shape. It needed to have a list of demands. That is where the Declaration of Sentiments comes from. She's also the first president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which will go by a number of names in its lifetime. She's an author, an advocate, an organizer, and she really recognizes that the vote had to be first, that organizing for women's rights across the board is essential. The Seneca Falls Convention focused on many of the ways in which American women's lives were inequitable and unequal, but she understood that without the vote, it would be very challenging to affect political change. I wanted to show you a little just illustration of the Seneca Falls Convention. This was a 3-day convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Many of the organizers were Quakers. The Quaker community was a huge component of the early years of the women's movement in the United States. You'll see here, this is the roll of honor. These are all the individuals who signed that Declaration of Sentiments that Stanton and her supporters had created. Many of these women would be key players in the suffrage movement of the 19th century. Many of these women were glass ceiling shatterers in their own right. And you will notice, of course, that there are gentlemen supporting them. Some of these are, of course, the spouses of the women organizing these events. But I want to point out a particular name under gentlemen, the name of Frederick Douglass. You'll see it on the far left side of the men's column. He's about the 5th name down. Frederick Douglass was a lifelong supporter of women's rights, but especially women's suffrage. In fact, on the day he died, he had spent his day in Washington, D.C., advocating and attending an event for women's suffrage. Now, if you visit Washington, D.C. and come to the U.S. Capitol building and take a Capitol tour, you'll have a chance to see this beautiful portrait monument. This portrait monument was a gift from the National Women's Party to the nation. It was created by a sculptor, Adelaide Johnson, who knew all 3 of these women represented here, knew Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. Adelaide Johnson saw herself as the primary artist, the documenter of the women's movement, and in her dream, there would be a museum with statues and busts to all of the women who had fought so hard for equal rights. So she creates this portrait monument, and it is gifted to the nation February 1921. This is just shortly after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Finally, right, gender is removed as a barrier to the ballot box. Congress accepts the monument, the gift, at a big ceremony in the Capitol. And then the next day, they haul it down to the crypt and they leave it off public display, for the next 70 years. It wouldn't be until 1997 that it was moved back to the rotunda on permanent display in the public space that it is in today. And that really happens because of the advocacy of women being elected to Congress. 1992 was one of the largest classes of women to ever be elected to Congress, and they really advocated over the next 5 years to get the portrait monument placed in the rotunda of the Capitol. One of the things I love about this monument is you can see the 3 women here in the front very clearly. From the left, that's Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott. But in the back, you may notice there's sort of this like funky clump of stone. It looks like maybe Adelaide Johnson forgot something or never finished it, but no, she did not. She left it unfinished on purpose. It is meant to be a space for a future woman. Maybe me, maybe you, maybe someone we don't even know yet, but it's a reminder of the generations of women that will come after these 3, and it is a space for a future leader of this movement. Now, I hadn't had a chance really to talk about Susan B. Anthony, but she is an essential component of the story of women's suffrage. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were a duo, although Susan B. Anthony was not part of the Seneca Falls Convention. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton would form a partnership and a friendship, sometimes a complicated one, with the shared common goal of securing women the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony never married, never had children, so she had the freedom to travel around the country. She had the freedom to be arrested, something that happened to her several times when she would go to vote. This quote that I have on the screen here is from a speech that she would give a number of times throughout her lifetime on women's right to vote. And you really see that she's referencing the US Constitution, the preamble here. She's talking about we the people from the preamble and what that we the people means. And I love the we, the whole people who form the union, this idea that it really is all of us. Susan B. Anthony would be part of lots of important demonstrations and civil disobedience, including an act of civil disobedience tied to the centennial of the Declaration, which we'll get to a moment. But I wanted to mention two women who were part of this era of the 1800s, post-Civil War, pushing for women's suffrage, but also women's rights. This is Belva Lockwood. Again, this is a portrait from the National Portrait Gallery. So you're seeing the beautiful artwork from the Portrait Gallery. Belva Lockwood, was a teacher and an educator. Like many women in the 19th century, education provided the best job opportunities. However, Belva Lockwood realizes fairly quickly that she is getting paid less to do the work of men. There are men who are serving as superintendents and principals, jobs that she's holding, and yet she is making considerably less. This is something that will provide or prove to be a point of agitation in her professional career and eventually leads her to have an interest in studying the law. She decides that she is going to attend law school. She will attend law school in Washington, D.C. at what is now George Washington University Law. She was not accepted to her first choice law school. They wouldn't take her as a woman, but GW does. So she does all of the coursework. She completes all of her classes. And when she is done, she and other female students are denied their diplomas. When she asks why, she is simply told there's no reason for her to have a diploma. She's not going to practice law. Women don't practice law. That's not what happens. And so they would not give her or the other female students their diplomas. After a few months of trying to pressure the college, she decides to go straight to the source. She goes to the Board of Trustees, which includes the President of the United States at the time, Ulysses S. Grant. Belva Lockwood would write directly to Grant about the inequity of this, the inequality of this, the injustice of this. And within a week of receiving that letter, she would have her law school diploma. So she gets her diploma. She needs it to be admitted to the bar. She's the one of the first women in DC to be admitted to the bar. And then, of course, if you're a lawyer, you want to be barred to argue before the Supreme Court. And so she will become the first woman to advocate for that and then to get barred. She will argue two cases before the Supreme Court. She will also be the author of a bill that will become a law in Congress, an act to relieve certain legal disabilities of women. This will specifically help make it illegal to discriminate against female lawyers when it comes to being barred for federal courts. She's also the first woman to run for president who can appear on a ballot. For Victoria Woodhull does run for president before Belva Lockwood, but she was not of age and appeared on really no ballots. Belva Lockwood is the first person or first woman to run for president who might have actually won. She runs twice in 1884 and 1888, although she does not win any of the states in the Electoral College. She does garner votes in the states that she appears on the ballot. Belva Lockwood is actually buried here in Washington, D.C. at Congressional Cemetery. There's fairly new, that's the in the back. That is her original marker. You can see the newer marker has been placed just a few years ago. There's also been new signage actually added on either side, flanking the gravesite to really share with visitors the impact of Belva Lockwood and the inspiration, particularly for women in the law. My favorite thing about Belva is she was also a big advocate for women and the bicycle. She realized that male lawyers were traveling around town a lot faster than she was because they were all riding bicycles. And so she would purchase a bicycle. She called it a game changer. She believed it was the most significant invention for women. It gave them freedom and mobility. So she would bike around Washington, D.C. on her bicycle to and from court and to and from her office, and often she would ride her bicycle with her pet parrot, Polly, who would perch on her shoulder. Now, Belva was very good friends with and I don't mean that euphemistically, truly, they were good friends. Was very good friends with Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, who is another trailblazer for women. Mary Edwards Walker would call herself the original new woman. She was born in New York. She's born in the 1830s, so before the Civil War. She's raised in a very egalitarian household. She grows up on a farm. There's this idea that everybody has to chip in. Everybody has to contribute. So she grows up with an education and with opportunity and with a desire to be a doctor. She is going to attend medical school. She tries to be a teacher, but she's really passionate about medicine. So she'll go to medical school. She's one of the earliest women in the United States to graduate from medical school. Elizabeth Blackwell gets her medical degree just 6 years prior. So this is a very early era. She does get married. She and her husband start a medical practice together, but they find it very, very difficult to get patients. People don't want to come see a female doctor. Their marriage also doesn't last. She never even changed her name. She wanted to keep her own name. He's a bit of a philanderer. So things fall apart with the medical practice and they fall apart in her marriage. She decides perhaps that there's maybe a better opportunity for her elsewhere. And as the Civil War begins, she sees a chance for a way, a venue to practice her medicine. She figures the US government, the US Army, the US military is going to need doctors. So she comes down to Washington, D.C. She offers up her services, but no one will hire her. No one will commission her. She actually starts working at a Civil War hospital without a job and without a commission to prove her mettle. She's so good at it that eventually she will be commissioned to be a battlefield doctor. She'll get passes to go onto the battlefield. She's the first female doctor employed by the US military. She treats not just US, but also Confederate soldiers, and she would even go behind enemy lines in order to treat both both US and Confederate troops. At the end of the Civil War, she is awarded the Medal of Honor for her military service. Many Medal of Honors were awarded during the Civil War era, but she's particularly identified among only a handful of other medical personnel for really going above and beyond, for traveling behind enemy lines, and for treating all of her patients with the utmost care. She and Belva Lockwood were very good friends. They would spend a lot of time together in Washington, D.C. They were both very involved in the suffrage movement, but both she and Belva Lockwood would find themselves often on the outside of the suffrage movement because they were not just interested in advocating for women's vote. These were women who wanted equal opportunity for education for women. They wanted equal opportunity for employment. Lockwood and Walker were professional women with jobs. That did not always jive with the image that some of the suffragist advocates wanted to put forward. The fact, as you can see in this image, that Mary Edwards Walker wore pants was often a point of contention. She's a doctor. She's out there doing amputations. She's, out on the battlefield. Who's going to wear a dress in that situation? She was an advocate for clothing reform for women. It's what she referred to as rational dress, the idea that you should dress reasonably and rationally for whatever your task is that day. Sometimes that might be a dress, but sometimes that might be pants. This did make her an outlier, though, in the suffrage community. She was ostracized by many of the professional suffrage groups because she was maybe a little too radical, a little too on the outside. She was also a bit of a teetotaler, which doesn't surprise me as a doctor. She advocated against women drinking and against women consuming tobacco. I will mention that her Medal of Honor was rescinded, along with hundreds of medals of honor in a sweep in the early 20th century. The official kind of reason was because there were no other doctors of her status that had that Medal of Honor, but that's actually not true. They kept a few other similar Medal of Honor citations for male doctors, so it very much seemed to be targeting those who did not fit the ideal for the Medal of Honor in the early 20th century. Luckily, during the Carter administration, the United States Army reinstated her Medal of Honor. And this is a mind-blowing fact to me in 2026. She is still the only woman to have been a recipient of our highest military decoration. Now, I mentioned that Lockwood, Walker, these ladies were a little radical. There was some radical movement happening in the 19th century when it came to fighting for women's suffrage. And I mentioned that Susan B. Anthony got into a little bit of civil disobedience during the American Centennial. You'll see here on the screen the Declaration of Rights of the Women of the United States. 1876, it's America's centennial. We're celebrating 100 years of the Declaration of Independence. There's a big event at Independence Hall. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, other important ladies are invited to come and watch the proceedings, but they request to speak, they're denied. They request to have formal involvement, they're denied. And so 6 ladies decide to go rogue. Even though a few of them have passes to be observers, they decide to crash the stage. You can see this is just a little snippet on the screen from the Declaration of Rights. If you haven't read it, I really encourage you to read the whole document. It was written by Stanton, Anthony, and a woman named Matilda Gage. Here they are, the Declaration of Rights. You can see a little bit more of the document here. 6 women are there at Independence Hall. Senator Lee is reading the Declaration of Independence. He finishes, people are clapping and cheering, and then Susan B. Anthony and the other women just rush to the stage. They run onto the stage. Senator Lee, according to newspapers, was stunned by the interruption, and then Susan B. Anthony reads this Declaration on the Rights of the Women of the United States. So they basically just stage crashed this official event to really remind those gathered that the promises of the Declaration were not being fulfilled for many, many people living in the United States. So it's easy to romanticize, I think, the efforts of the women in the 19th century, this idea that they were writing petitions and letters and everything was very polite and civilized, but there was a lot of civil disobedience that was happening. And as we continue thinking about the scope of women in America in the last 250 years, I think it's important to note a few women of color. Many of these women were advocates not just for women's suffrage, but also abolition, for workers' rights, for educational opportunities. They were advocating for civil rights and anti-lynching laws and anti-discriminatory laws. And they play an important role in the story of America. I included just a snippet here from speech, a plea for the white South, given by Mary Church Terrell. Mary Church Terrell coined the phrase that would come to represent, I think, the experience of these women, which she called the double burden. For her, that was the experience of Black women in the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s. She is specifically speaking to the fact that within the civil rights movement, these Black women are still experiencing a great deal of sexism, that they're being denied opportunities because of their gender, that they're, even though they're often founding members of these civil rights organizations, they're being kept out of roles and offices. And yet, within many of the female spaces, the suffrage movement in particular, there's still a great deal of racism because of the color of their skin. And so these are women that are fighting against challenges and difficulties on all sides. Mary Church Terrell is, I think, one of the most influential women in American history. She is at her core an educator. She would be at the forefront of education in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere for the entirety of her life. She was also truly an activist on every level. She is the founding member of just about every major civil rights organization of the late 1800s, early 1900s. She's also the founder of many, many women's organizations, most significantly the Colored Women's League and the National Association of Colored Women, but she's also a founder of the National American University Women, which was an organization she founded when she was rejected from another university women's club. She also had no qualms about getting out there and really being an advocate. She was not kowtowed by a fear of arrest. She was like a Susan B. Anthony in that she was willing to get arrested to organize pickets and boycotts and sit-ins, and that advocacy would continue through her life. She would actually help organize one of the first federal lawsuits in 1950 against a restaurant called Thompson's. This would be several years before we have Board versus Brown of Education and a few other really key civil rights decisions from the Supreme Court. But she would sue this restaurant for discrimination. And with the District of Columbia being a federal district and not a state or city, they're going to be able to get a decision that really leads to the desegregation of federal spaces and public spaces in the federal city. I feel so grateful to be in Washington, D.C., because we do have a lot of recognition for Mary Church Terrell and her contributions throughout her lifetime. If you look on the side of the screen where it says her name here with two images on either side, this is a development near our sports arena, near Capital One Arena, that is named Terrell Place. They named it for her because there used to be a department store on this location, a Hex department store. And in her late 80s and early 90s, she was leading protests and pickets outside of the department store because of their discriminatory hiring practice, pay practices, and their refusal to serve Black patrons and shoppers at their lunch counter. So truly a life of advocacy. And then this yellow and purple piece of art maybe that you're seeing here in the center is a call box. Call boxes were like early forms of emergency services. You'd go to them to get your fire, police. Many of them in Washington, D.C. have been turned into kind of tributes and memorials to significant women. So you'll see a quotation from Mary Church Terrell. That's actually from the top of her call box. Another key woman and a contemporary to Mary Church is Ida B. Wells. She'll become Ida B. Wells Barnett through marriage. She is a journalist. That is her trade initially. She's an exceptional writer. She would document a lot of the injustices of the progressive era. She, like Mary, would be really drawn into the movement through education, but also through journalism. She would become an anti-lynching activist after the lynching of a friend of hers in Tennessee. And what she does is she doesn't just write editorial. She doesn't just write about the pure injustice of it. She really studies and documents these lynchings through a sociological lens. She compiles statistics and data on lynchings in the United States that up to this point had not been well documented. She is deeply engaged in the suffrage movement, including founding the Alpha Suffrage Club. The 1913 suffrage parade here in Washington, D.C., was a segregated march. The organizers, including Alice Paul, wanted to keep the Southern participants happy. And so they encouraged the Black suffragists to march in the back, but you cannot tell Ida B. Wells where to march. She made sure to just wait on the sidelines and then slid in with her almost entirely white delegation from Chicago. Here in Washington, we have something called the Points of Light volunteer pathway. These are medallions that are embedded through downtown DC. It covers about 6 blocks total. A wide range of Americans are represented in this pathway. It's called the Extra Mile. And you can see that we have one here for Ida Wells, really for her advocacy and crusade for civil rights through her entire life. We also just recently named a school in DC after her, and 5 years ago, they dedicated a wonderful statue, which you can see here. You've got the open book, really a reference to her many writings and her work as a publisher, an author, and a journalist. And then we see her holding up that light, really helping to lead the way. Just taking a look, I saw there was a comment in there. Okay, perfect. Yes, please post your questions. I'll be sure to get to them when we wrap up in a few minutes. Now, I wanted to transition us into a little bit more of a contemporary era for our last couple of mentions. And I thought that this quote was really quite relevant from suffragist and women's rights activist Anna Howard Shaw. Take any of the magnificent appeals for freedom which men make and rob them of their universal application, and you take the very life and soul out of them. So as we're moving into the 20th century, as there's this progressive era of labor advocacy and civil rights advocacy, women's rights continue to be a key component of that story. That also includes, of course, the rights of Indigenous women. I think that I would be remiss if I didn't mention Sakala Sa. Of course, Indigenous women, essential to the story of America, and particularly American 250. The contributions of Indigenous women with the Oneida and other key tribes were really essential to our success in the American Revolution. But Sakala Sa is, to me, such a bridge between generations. Having grown up in an America that was still pushing west, she's a Yankton Dakota. She lives 8 years on Dakota land with Dakota family and with a Dakota community. But when she is 8 years old, she is taken to a missionary school for 3 years in Indiana. She wrote about that experience, about not being able to use her language, about being forced to cut her hair, about being forced to pray as a Quaker and not practice her own religion and her own spiritual beliefs. She comes back home after those 3 years, but she now sees herself as a person divided, and she becomes more aware when she returns to the Dakota community of how quickly they're assimilating into the American culture to the detriment of losing their cultural heritage as Dakotas. She will spend the rest of her life being an advocate and a voice for Native Americans and Native people. She's a writer, an editor, a musician. She actually writes the libretto and songs for the first American Indian opera, among many, many other musical compositions that she creates. She actually, when she graduated from high school, the very first public speech she delivered was about women's rights in the United States, and particularly the struggles of Indigenous women. And she would continue to do this throughout her lifetime. She is co-founder and president of the National Council of American Indians, a role that she would hold until her death. She really wanted to highlight and document the reality of the Indigenous experience in the United States. She really called for a united tribal community in 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act that would help provide and restore some of the civil rights that were necessary to a number of Native people. She would travel around the country, really helping Indigenous people understand what their rights were and how to best practice them. She also joined the General Federation of Women's Clubs to help bring that Indigenous women's perspective to this women's organization, which at that point had been about 30 years old, and to really help other women learn how they could be better advocates for the Indigenous community, particularly women. She is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Her husband was a veteran and had served in World War I. And then another great portrait here from the National Portrait Gallery. This is Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune, you could spend hours and hours talking about the incredible contributions that she makes to the United States. She would create or found a school that is now Bethune-Cookman University, would become Bethune-Cookman College. She recognizes that education will be key for success, particularly for Black Americans. She will recognize that schooling isn't just about what you learn in a book. It's about establishing responsibility. It's about learning life skills. It's about learning how to be an advocate. It's about having access to 3 square meals a day and about having access to medical care. And so the schools that she founds and runs are about providing care for the whole child and for the whole community. She would eventually become the founder and president of the National Council of Negro Women, an organization that she creates to really help provide Black women the tools they need to be engaged in their communities, to fight back against Jim Crow, to fight back against disenfranchisement in the South in particular, and to really help give women a space to which they could be advocates without engaging in civil disobedience. She understood that for many of these women in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, they couldn't risk being arrested. They couldn't risk losing their jobs. So what are the avenues? Who are the people you can connect with to help advocate for change? She was an advisor to, in total, 5 US presidents, but she had the closest relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. She was part of FDR's Black Cabinet, a group of Black advisors who were key to ensuring that the New Deal and the social and financial programs that were part of that New Deal were spread throughout the South and didn't ignore Black communities that could desperately use them. She and Eleanor would have a lifetime friendship. If you read Eleanor Roosevelt's newspaper column, My Day, which is digitized, you'll see several references to Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune also has the distinction of being the first American woman in Washington, D.C. to have a statue in public space. If you can believe it, there are only 3 American women who have public statues in outdoor public spaces in Washington, D.C. I just showed you Ida B. Wells. Mary McLeod Bethune was the very first, and then the third is Eleanor Roosevelt. She has a statue in her husband's memorial right on the tidal basin. Mary McLeod Bethune's memorial here was dedicated just 20 years after her death in the 1970s. Notice that she has a cane in her hand. You might have seen she's holding a cane in her portrait as well. She did not need that for any disability or mobility purposes. She called it her swank. She just liked having it as a little talking point. She used it as a conversation starter. You'll notice she's actually handing down a piece of paper to these children. This is a reference to her lifelong dedication to education. She also has inscribed along the base some of excerpts from her last will and testament. To the right on the screen there, that is the statue of Mary McLeod Bethune that is inside the U.S. Capitol. We have a statuary collection in the U.S. Capitol building of 100 statues, two from all 50 states. Of those statues in the present day, right now, 15 of them are women. If you visited the US Capitol building 6 years ago, only 9 of them were women. So we've started to really increase the number of women there. But you can see she's got the cane there as well. Speaking of the US Capitol, I did want to mention just a couple of women from the 20th century who really helped kind of pave a path for other women. Of course, it's essential for me to quote Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to run for president of the United States. In a speech advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment, she reminds those gathered inside of the House of Representatives that there were no black founding fathers, there were no founding mothers, but it is not too late for us to fix that, to address what was undone or left undone by our founding fathers. Two women really kind of who were trailblazers on Capitol Hill. Margaret Chase Smith. She was the voice of America's conscience. She is the first woman to be elected to serve in the House and Senate. She's one of the longest serving women in the House and Senate. She was also an advocate from the beginning for women in the military service. She was the mother of the wave. She created the legislation, wrote the legislation that established that auxiliary unit, and wrote several pieces of legislation supporting female veterans of World War II and supporting resources for women to serve their country during the Second World War. She herself actually served in the Air Force Reserve, which I think is a pretty cool thing to do. And as you can see, she was the first woman in Congress to break the sound barrier in 1957. The reason I like to mention her, though, is when she was a freshman senator. She's the first woman to have gone from the House to the Senate. There's only ever been a handful of women in the Senate. She's a freshman senator. It is a very difficult time in the United States. We've got the rise of McCarthyism, and yet at a time where our core values from our founding documents, from the Declaration, are being challenged and being abused by men like Joseph McCarthy, Senator Margaret Chase Smith got onto the floor of the Senate and gave her conscience speech. She talked about, without ever naming McCarthy, talked about the core values of what makes America America. She talks about how we cannot let ourselves be divided. We cannot throw around words and accusations when we have a free country and we have the right to express our views freely. And this would really set a tone for the way in which she would carry herself in Congress. And she did that knowing that it could jeopardize her career. However, it earned her the respect of her constituents, and they would continue to reelect her to Congress. And then finally, what better woman to wrap up a 250 sort of travel through history than Patsy Mink? I don't know if there was a stronger woman, a stronger advocate for women in Congress than Patsy Mink. She's the first woman of color to be elected to Congress. She's elected in 1964. She's the first Asian American woman to be elected to Congress. She would be at the forefront of key legislation for women, legislation that looked at the needs of women in the workplace, the needs of women as students, access to equal education. She is the co-author, of the Title IX of the Educational Amendments of 1972. Title IX is what is going to make sure that we have equal funding and equal support for academics, for any of these educational institutions that take federal money, the importance of making sure that they are being equitable in the distribution of federal funds. This is particularly important for female students in athletics. She would also co-author the legislation that would create Head Start. She was an advocate for gender equity in schools, and a lot of her educational legislation would be centered around that idea. She actually served 2 long stretches in Congress, and in her second stretch, she was a co-founder of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. I have so much I could say about Patsy Mink, but the biggest thing I would say is she almost didn't even end up in Congress. She wanted to be a doctor. She wanted to go to medical school, and it was only because she was rejected from every medical school she applied to because of her gender. So even 100 years after Mary Edwards Walker, many schools were rejecting working women that she ended up finding herself choosing law school as a backup choice. It was that a pathway into the law that brought her into Congress. But she could have been Dr. Patsy Mink if she'd been accepted to medical school. In the US Capitol building, both of these women are honored for being such trailblazers. The portrait you see here to the left is a portrait that was commissioned by Congress to honor Patsy Mink as the mother of Title IX. The colors here are actually inspired by her home state of Hawaii. The floral design in the background actually comes from native plants from Hawaii. This is on display in the Capitol building. And then inside the Capitol on the Senate side, a room has been named for Margaret Chase Smith. To honor her long service in the US Senate. What a whirlwind. I only have an hour, so it's impossible to cover 250 years of America's history. It's hard to tell you all the wonderful places in Washington, D.C., where you can see women's history being celebrated. But I mentioned a few today, showed you a few today. I wanted to just encourage everyone to visit the America 250 website. There are America 250 events happening all across the United States, in towns and communities all across America. So I hope you'll get engaged in America 250 in some way. If you're planning to visit Washington, D.C., you can grab our book, the 111 Places book, and it will have lots and lots of wonderful suggestions for you to honor women's history when you come to visit D.C. But I will pause talking for a moment. We've got about 5 minutes. I'd love to answer questions if anyone has questions. I'd be happy to answer them.
I don't see anything in the chat yet, but we'll give it a few minutes. That was a tremendous program. Thank you. I learned so much. While we're waiting to see if anyone else has questions, what out of the women you discussed tonight, which one is your favorite?
I have been really on the Mary Catherine Goddard train the last year or two. I think as we've been coming up to this 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the idea that just like the signers of the Declaration, she was willing to put her name on what would have been a treasonous document to risk that loss of her business, something that for a woman in this era was so easy to lose. I mean, and we see this, her brother forces her out of her printing job in 1784. The postmaster general takes away her postmaster job. So those things eventually did happen, but she didn't let the risk of that stop her from printing the Declaration. And I think that's just so incredible. It just really moves me and it inspires me. And I hope it's a story that we learn more about and that we hear her name more because it was right at the beginning. It was right at the cusp of our nation's birth.
Yes. So still no questions in the chat, but we'll continue with our wrap up. And if anyone has any questions, they are more than welcome to put them in the chat. We want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. When the Zoom closes, a short survey will appear. We would love your feedback. Tonight's program was recorded and will be available shortly. For information about upcoming programs, including America 250 programs, please visit putnamcountylibrary.org. And now I'll turn things back over to Rebecca for closing comments.
So there was a question in the chat. How long have I been doing this? Thank you so much, Mary, for your compliment there. I have been a tour guide in Washington, D.C., a tour guide and public historian for about 14 years. A Tour of Our Own was founded in 2018. So really focusing in on women's history, specifically in a very deliberate and considerate way, is a somewhat newer path for me in my professional work. But it's been such a joy to get to do that. But I've been guiding for 14 years and talking about Washington, D.C. for 14 years. And just for my closing remarks, I want to thank so much the Putnam County Library for being such a great partner to A Tour of Our Own. We are a woman-owned and operated business. We really appreciate the support. It's tough to be a small business sometimes, and we are here in Washington, D.C. We believe in place-based learning, but we love these virtual events because we love a chance to get to share these stories and these sites and these memorials and markers and artwork with you. And so it was such a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you very much. And I hope that everybody finds a way to celebrate America 250 that inspires them this summer.
Yes, and we have a lot of programs coming up for America 250, concerts, virtual programs. So please join us or join a program near you, wherever you are joining from. And thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.